There are places in this world where the earth remembers violence, where the soil holds secrets that time refuses to soften, and where the wind carries voices of men who believed they were fighting for something that mattered. Ash Creek was one of those places. Nestled deep in the jagged folds of the northern Wyoming wilderness, it was a mining settlement that existed only because men were willing to descend into darkness for the promise of coal and a paycheck that barely kept their families fed. The year was 1949, and the world outside was rebuilding itself after a war that had consumed millions. But in Ash Creek, a different kind of war was brewing. One that would be written in blood, betrayal, and the cold logic of men who had stopped believing in law and started believing only in revenge. The story begins not with violence, but with something far quieter and far more insidious: exhaustion. The miners of Ash Creek worked 12-hour shifts in tunnels that seemed to swallow light and hope in equal measure. They descended each morning into shafts that groaned and shifted, where the air tasted of sulfur and damp stone, where every breath felt borrowed and every step forward was a negotiation with death. The coal company that owned the mine, Blackridge Industrial, a faceless entity headquartered hundreds of miles away, cared little for men who extracted its profit. Safety inspections were rare, equipment was outdated, and the single generator that powered the ventilation system, the lights, and the water pumps was older than most of the men who depended on it. When that generator failed, the mine became a tomb. Everyone knew it. Everyone feared it. And on a cold February morning in 1949, that fear became reality. The generator had been acting up for weeks. The foreman, a lean, hard-eyed man named Otto Halvorsen, had sent word to the company 3 separate times, requesting a replacement or at least a qualified mechanic to inspect the machinery. Each time, his requests were met with bureaucratic delays, promises that never materialized, and thinly veiled suggestions that the miners were exaggerating the problem. Otto was not a man given to exaggeration. He was Norwegian by birth, a veteran of both the First World War and the brutal mines of Montana, and he carried himself with the quiet authority of someone who had learned that survival required vigilance, discipline, and an unwillingness to tolerate weakness, especially in himself. He had been foreman at Ash Creek for 6 years, and in that time he had built a crew of men who trusted him, men who knew that when Otto Halvorsen gave an order, it was because he had already calculated the cost of disobedience. His crew was composed of 10 men, most of them immigrants or sons of immigrants, men who had come to America with nothing and had found work in the only place that would take them, underground. There was Lars Einarson, a giant of a man with hands like sledgehammers and a laugh that could fill a barracks. Pyotr Kaminsky, quiet and methodical, who wrote letters to his mother in Poland every Sunday without fail. Samuel Crow, the youngest of the group, barely 22, with a wife and an infant daughter waiting for him in a cabin 3 miles from the mine, and 7 others, each with their own stories, their own reasons for being there, their own families depending on the coal dust they brought home on their clothes and in their lungs. They were not friends in the traditional sense. Men who work in the dark together rarely are, but they were bound by something stronger than friendship, the knowledge that they kept each other alive. On the morning of February 14th, Valentine's Day, the generator finally gave out. It happened just after the morning shift had descended into the main shaft, 200 feet below the surface, where the air was already thin and the walls seemed to press inward with every passing hour. The lights flickered once, twice, and then went dark. The ventilation fans, which had been laboring for weeks with mechanical wheeze that sounded almost human, fell silent. In the sudden absence of noise, the mine became a cathedral of stillness, broken only by the sound of men breathing and the distant drip of water from unseen cracks in the stone. Otto Halvorsen, standing near the coal face with a pickaxe in hand, felt the temperature drop immediately. Without the fans, the air would become toxic within hours. Without the pumps, the lower tunnels would flood. Without the lights, they were blind. He called for an immediate evacuation, his voice calm but firm, and the men began the long climb back to the surface, moving in single file through passages so narrow that their shoulders scraped the walls. They emerged into pale winter light, their faces blackened with cold dust, their eyes adjusting to the brightness, and found the foreman from the day's shift, a man named Gareth Mills, standing near the generator shed with his arms crossed and a look on his face that Otto recognized immediately. It was the look of someone who had made a decision and was preparing to defend it. Gareth Mills was a company man through and through, the kind of supervisor who measured loyalty by how much inconvenience he was willing to ignore for the sake of productivity. He and Otto had clashed before, most recently over the issue of the failing generator, and now, standing in the cold morning air with 10 men behind him who had just narrowly avoided death, Otto felt the anger that he usually kept buried begin to rise. Gareth spoke first, his voice carrying the flat, administrative tone of someone delivering bad news. The generator, he said, had been inspected the previous week by a company mechanic, and the report had concluded that it was in acceptable working condition. The failure, he suggested, was likely due to operator error. Perhaps someone had tampered with the fuel line, or failed to perform the necessary maintenance checks. Otto listened in silence, his jaw tightening, and then he asked a single question. Who had performed the inspection? Gareth hesitated, and in that hesitation, Otto saw the truth. There had been no inspection. The report was a fabrication, a piece of paper designed to protect the company from liability, and now 10 men had nearly suffocated because of it. Otto turned to his crew, saw the same realization dawning on their faces, and made a decision that would alter the course of all their lives. He walked to the generator shed, pushed open a rusted metal door, and knelt beside the machine. The others followed, forming a half-circle around him, and watched as he traced the fuel line with his fingers, examining the connections, the fittings, the places where metal met metal. What he found confirmed his suspicion. The fuel line had been deliberately cut not cleanly, but in a way that suggested someone had used a dull blade or rock, sawing through the rubber until it split. The sabotage was crude but effective, designed to cause a failure that could be blamed on wear and tear. Otto stood slowly, his face unreadable, and turned to Gareth Mills, who had remained at a distance, his expression shifting from defiance to something closer to fear. The confrontation that followed was brief and brutal. Otto demanded to know who had sabotaged the generator, and when Gareth insisted he had no knowledge of it, Otto seized him by the collar and slammed him against the shed wall hard enough to rattle the corrugated metal. The other miners, sensing the shift in atmosphere, moved closer, forming a wall of silent solidarity behind their foreman. Gareth, realizing that he was outnumbered and outmatched, tried to deflect, claiming that the company had received complaint about Otto's crew, complaint about slowdowns, about insubordination, about a refusal to meet quotas. The implication was clear. The sabotage had been ordered from above, a way to create a crisis that would justify replacing Otto and his men with workers who were more compliant, more desperate, more willing to risk their lives for a few extra dollars. Otto released him, stepped back, and spoke in a voice that was low and cold and filled with certainty that made every man present understand that something irreversible had just occurred. He said that the mine was now closed, that his crew would not descend again until the generator was replaced and the man responsible for the sabotage was held accountable, and that if the company wanted to fight them, they would find that miners knew how to fight back. Gareth Mills left Ash Creek that afternoon, driving his company truck down the narrow dirt road that led to the highway, and he did not return. What he did instead was send word to Blackridge Industrial's regional office, and within 48 hours, the company had made its response. Otto Halvorsen and his crew were fired, effective immediately, and a new crew would be brought in to replace them. The new crew arrived on February 16th, transported in a convoy of trucks, and they were men who had been recruited from other mines, other towns, men who had been promised higher wages and better conditions in exchange for crossing the line that Otto's men had drawn. They were strikebreakers, though the company did not use that word, and they were escorted into Ash Creek by a security detail hired by Blackridge, ex-soldiers, most of them, men who had returned from the war with skills that translated poorly to civilian life, but perfectly to the kind of work that involved enforcing corporate will with violence. The 10 miners of Otto Halvorsen's crew watched the new men arrive, watched them unload their equipment and settle into bunkhouses that had been home to Otto's crew just days before, and they felt something that went beyond anger or betrayal. They felt disposable. They felt erased. And in that erasure, they found a clarity of purpose that transformed them from laborers into something else entirely. Otto gathered his men that night in a cabin on the outskirts of Ash Creek, a place that belonged to Lars Einarsson's family, and he laid out a plan. They would not simply walk away. They would not let the company bury them in paperwork and forgetfulness. They would make the new crew understand that Ash Creek was not theirs to claim. and they would make Blackridge Industrial understand that men who work in the dark are not afraid of it. The first act of the feud came 3 days later, on February 19th. The new crew had begun working the mine, operating the hastily repaired generator, and extracting coal under the supervision of a replacement foreman who had been brought in from Montana, a man named Dale Hutchins, who was known in mining circles as someone willing to push men harder than was safe, and who saw accidents as the cost of doing business. Otto's crew waited until nightfall, then moved through the forest that surrounded Ash Creek with the quiet efficiency of men who had spent years navigating the darkness. They carried no weapons, not yet, only tools, axes, crowbars, lengths of chain, and they approached the mine entrance under cover of the moonless night. Their target was not the men inside, but the infrastructure that kept the mine running. They sabotaged the water pump, draining the coolant and filling the reservoir with sand. They cut the power lines that ran from the generator to the main shaft. They scattered nails across the access road, puncturing the tires of the company trucks. And then they vanished back into the forest, leaving no trace except the damage itself, which would not be discovered until morning shift attempted to descend and found the mine inoperable. The company's response was swift and severe. Blackridge Industrial filed complaints with a local sheriff, a man named Eugene Barlow, who was sympathetic to the miners, but ultimately beholden to the law and to the political pressure that the company could bring to bear. Sheriff Barlow visited Otto Halvorsen at Lars Einarsson's cabin and delivered a warning. If the sabotage continued, arrests would be made, and the men involved would face charges of criminal destruction of property, conspiracy, and possibly even attempted murder if anyone was injured as a result of their actions. Otto listened, nodded, and offered no admission of guilt. He simply said that the company had started this by valuing profit over lives, and that if they wanted to end, they knew what needed to happen. The saboteur of the generator needed to be identified and punished, and Otto's crew needed to be reinstated with back pay and a formal apology. Sheriff Barlow left the cabin knowing that his warning had been ignored, and that the situation in Ash Creek was about to escalate beyond his ability to control it. The new crew, for their part, were not passive victims. They were men who had been hired precisely because they were willing to work in hostile conditions, and they understood that their presence in Ash Creek made them targets. Dale Hutchins, the replacement foreman, organized them into shifts that included armed guards, men from the security detail, who patrolled the mine entrance and the surrounding area with rifles slung over their shoulders. The message was clear. Any further sabotage would be met with force. Otto's crew, watching from the forest, saw the guards and understood that the rules of engagement had changed. What had begun as an act of protest was becoming a war, and wars required different tools. On the night of February 23rd, Otto Halvorsen held another meeting with his 10 men, this time in a hunting cabin deeper in the wilderness, far from any road or settlement. He laid a map of Ash Creek on the table, marked with the locations of the mine, the bunkhouses, the generator shed, and the access routes that the company used to transport coal and supplies. He spoke in the same calm, measured tone he had always used, but there was something different in his eyes now, a hardness that had not been there before, a willingness to cross lines that most men spent their lives avoiding. He asked each man a question. How far were they willing to go? Were they willing to risk imprisonment? Were they willing to use violence if necessary? Were they willing to become the kind of men that the world would condemn, if it meant protecting their right to work, to survive, to be treated as something more than disposable? One by one, the men answered, and one by one, they said yes. Samuel Crow, the youngest, hesitated the longest, thinking of his wife and daughter, but in the end he too agreed, because he understood that if he walked away now, he would spend the rest of his life wondering if he had been a coward. The second act of the feud began on February 25th, and it was no longer about sabotage. It was about intimidation. Otto's crew, now armed with hunting rifles and shotguns borrowed or purchased from sympathetic locals, began a campaign of psychological warfare. They fired shots into the air near the mine entrance during the night shift, close enough to be heard, but far enough away to avoid hitting anyone. They left dead animals, deer, rabbits, coyotes, hanging from the trees along the access road, a message written in blood and decay. They burned effigies in the forest, figures made of straw and dressed in company overalls, set ablaze where the new crew could see the firelight flickering through the trees. The effect was immediate and profound. The new crew became afraid. Some of them quit outright, packing their belongings and leaving Ash Creek in the middle of the night, unwilling to risk their lives for a paycheck. Others stayed, but only because they had nowhere else to go, and they worked with a constant awareness that they were being watched, that the forest around them was full of eyes and anger and the promise of violence. Dale Hutchins, the replacement foreman, responded by escalating the security presence. He requested additional guards from Blackridge Industrial, and the company complied, sending a dozen more men, veterans with combat experience, equipped with military surplus weapons and the kind of training that made them far more dangerous than the miners they were meant to protect. The guards began conducting patrols through the forest, setting up perimeters, establishing checkpoints, and treating Ash Creek as if it were a war zone, because in many ways it was. The atmosphere in the settlement became oppressive, defined by suspicion and fear, and the few families who still lived in the area began to leave, packing their belongings into wagons and trucks and disappearing down the road, unwilling to remain in a place where men with guns walked the streets and the sound of gunfire had become routine. On the night of March 2nd, the feud claimed its first life. The details remain contested, debated by historians and journalists who have tried to reconstruct the events from fragmentary accounts and conflicting testimonies. But the essential facts are these. A guard named Thomas Ridley, patrolling the forest near the mine entrance, encountered someone in the darkness, a figure moving through the trees, armed, and refusing to identify themselves. Ridley called out a challenge, received no response, and fired a warning shot into the air. The figure fired back, and in an exchange that followed, Ridley was struck in the chest and died before help could arrive. His body was found the next morning, sprawled in the snow, his rifle still clutched in his hands, and the footprints leading away from the scene suggested that his killer had been a single person, moving alone, deliberate, and precise. The company immediately blamed Otto Halvorsen's crew and Sheriff Barlow, under immense pressure from Blackridge Industrial and the state government, issued warrants for the arrest of all 10 men on charges of murder and conspiracy. Otto and his crew vanished into the wilderness. They knew the forests of northern Wyoming better than the guards who were hunting them, and they used that knowledge to stay ahead of the search parties, moving at night, sleeping in caves and abandoned cabins, living off the land in a way that few modern men could sustain. They became ghosts, figures of rumor and fear, and the stories that began to circulate about them took on a mythic quality. Some said they could move without sound, that they could see in the dark, that they were protected by the land itself. The truth was simpler and sadder. They were tired, cold, hungry, and desperate, but they refused to surrender, because they believed that surrender meant admitting guilt, and guilt meant that the company had won, that the death of Thomas Ridley would be laid at their feet, while the real crime, the sabotage of the generator, the exploitation of workers, the willingness to let men die for profit, would be forgotten. The hunt for Otto Halvorsen's crew became a media spectacle. Newspapers across the country picked up the story, framing it in ways that reflected their own political biases. Some portrayed the miners as working-class heroes standing up to corporate tyranny, while others depicted them as dangerous radicals, criminals who had murdered an innocent man and were now evading justice. Radio broadcasts featured interviews with company executives, who spoke in measured tones about the need for law and order, and with labor organizers, who spoke with barely restrained fury about the conditions that had driven the miners to such extremes. The governor of Wyoming, facing mounting pressure to resolve the situation, authorized the deployment of the National Guard, and within a week, Ash Creek was occupied by soldiers, transforming the remote mining settlement into something resembling a military installation. Otto Halvorsen, hiding in the mountains with his men, listened to the radio broadcast on a battery-powered receiver that Lars Narsen had carried into the wilderness, and he understood that the situation had spiraled beyond any possibility of resolution. They had become symbols, abstractions, figures in narrative that no longer had anything to do with the reality of who they were or what they had wanted. He gathered his crew one final time, in a cave high above the valley where Ash Creek lay shrouded in winter fog, and he told them that they had a choice. They could surrender and face trial, trusting that the truth would emerge and that justice would be served, or they could continue running, knowing that eventually they would be caught or killed, and that their deaths would serve as a warning to other workers who might consider fighting back. The men discussed it through the night, their voices low and filled with exhaustion, and when dawn broke, they had reached a consensus. They would not surrender. They would make the company and the government pay a price for every step forward, and if they were going to be hunted, they would ensure that the hunt was costly. The final confrontation came on March 12th, in a narrow valley 15 miles north of Ash Creek, where Otto's crew had taken refuge in an old trapper's cabin that had been abandoned decades earlier. The National Guard, guided by local trackers and supported by the company's security detail, had been closing in for days, following footprints in the snow, abandoned campsites, and reports from hunters who had glimpsed men moving through the forest. When they surrounded the cabin just before dawn, they called for the miners to surrender, promising that they would be treated fairly, that they would have the opportunity to present their case in court. Otto Halvorsen, standing inside the cabin with his rifle in hand, looked at the faces of his men, Lars Einarsson, Pyotr Kaminsky, Samuel Crow, and the others, and saw in their eyes the same resolve that had brought them this far. He called back through the door, his voice carrying across the frozen ground. And he said that they would not surrender, that they had done nothing wrong except demand to be treated as human beings, and that if the soldiers wanted them, they would have to come and take them. The firefight lasted less than 10 minutes. The soldiers, armed with superior weapons and trained in tactics that the miners could not match, advanced on the cabin under covering fire, and the miners, outnumbered and outgunned, fought back with everything they had. The sound of gunfire echoed through the valley, sharp and brutal, and when it finally stopped, 7 of Otto Halvorsen's crew were dead, their bodies lying in the snow outside the cabin and inside its shattered walls. 3 survived, Otto himself, gravely wounded, along with Samuel Crow and a man named Henrik Vogel, and they were taken into custody, transported to a hospital under armed guard, and later transferred to a county jail to await trial. The trial of Otto Halvorsen and his surviving crew members became one of the most publicized legal proceedings of 1949. The prosecution, representing the state and backed by Blackridge Industrial, argued that the miners were murderers, criminals who had killed Thomas Ridley in cold blood and who had waged a campaign of terror against innocent workers and law enforcement. The defense, led by a labor attorney named Margaret Holt, who had volunteered her services, argued that the miners had been driven to desperation by a company that valued profit over safety, that the sabotage of the generator had been an act of corporate violence, and that the death of Thomas Ridley, while tragic, had occurred in the context of self-defense during an illegal occupation of land that the company did not own. The trial lasted 6 weeks, and the courtroom was packed every day with spectators, miners, union organizers, company representatives, journalists, and ordinary citizens who saw in the case a reflection of larger struggles over labor rights, corporate power, and the value of a working man's life. Otto Halvorsen testified in his own defense, and his testimony was calm, deliberate, and devastating. He described in detail the conditions in the mine, the repeated failures of the company to address safety concerns, the sabotage of the generator, and the decision to fire his crew rather than acknowledge wrongdoing. He spoke about the night Thomas Ridley was killed, and he stated, under oath, that none of his men had fired the shot that killed the guard, that the shooter had been someone else, someone who had taken advantage of the chaos to settle a personal score or to escalate the conflict in a way that would justify further violence. He could not prove this claim, he admitted, because the darkness and confusion had made it impossible to identify the shooter, but he believed it to be true, and he asked the jury to consider whether it made sense that men who had spent weeks avoiding bloodshed would suddenly commit murder. The prosecution dismissed this as a desperate lie, but the defense used it to introduce doubt, and doubt, in the American legal system, is supposed to be enough to prevent conviction. The jury deliberated for 3 days. When they returned, they delivered a verdict that reflected the complexity and the tragedy of the case. Otto Halvorsen and the 2 surviving members of his crew were found not guilty of murder, but guilty of conspiracy to commit criminal destruction of property and unlawful assembly. They were sentenced to 10 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 5. The verdict was met with mixed reactions. Some saw it as a miscarriage of justice, an acknowledgement that the miners had been right to fight, but refusal to fully exonerate them, while others saw it as a reasonable compromise, a recognition that the line between protest and violence is thin, and that crossing it, even for just reasons, carries consequences. Otto Halvorsen, standing in the courtroom as the sentence was read, showed no emotion. He simply nodded, turned to his lawyer, and thanked her for her efforts. The 7 men who had died in the firefight were buried in a small cemetery outside Ash Creek, in graves marked with simple wooden crosses that bore their names and the year of their deaths. The families of the dead men received no compensation from Blackridge Industrial, no apology, no acknowledgement that their loved ones had been anything other than criminals. The company, for its part, resumed operations at the mine, installed a new generator, and implemented a series of cosmetic safety improvements that were designed more to deflect criticism than to protect workers. Within a year, the events of 1949 had faded from the headlines, replaced by other stories, other tragedies, other struggles. Ash Creek continued to produce coal until 1963, when the mine was finally closed due to declining demand and the exhaustion of its most accessible seams. The settlement was abandoned, the buildings left to decay, and the forest began to reclaim the land, covering the scars of industry and violence with a blanket of green. Otto Halvorsen was released from prison in 1954 after serving 5 years of his sentence. He was 53 years old, his health broken by the conditions of his imprisonment and the lingering effects of the wounds he had sustained in the firefight. He returned to Wyoming, but not to Ash Creek. There was nothing left for him there. Instead, he settled in a small town near the Montana border, found work as a handyman, and lived quietly, avoiding attention, speaking rarely about the events of 1949. When journalists or historians approached him, seeking interviews or clarification, he turned them away, saying only that the past was done and that talking about it would not bring back the dead. He died in 1967, at the age of 66, of complications related to pneumoconiosis, black lung disease, the same affliction that eventually claimed most men who spent their lives in the mines. He was buried in an unmarked grave, his death noted in a single paragraph in the local newspaper, and his story, like the stories of so many men who fought and died in forgotten places, slipped quietly into margins of history. Samuel Crow, the youngest of the survivors, was released from prison in 1954 alongside Otto. He returned to his wife and daughter, who had waited for him, and he tried to rebuild a life that the events of 1949 had shattered. He found work in a lumber mill, saved enough money to buy a small house, and raised 3 children, but he never spoke about Ash Creek, not to his family, not to his friends, not even himself if he could help it. He carried the weight of those weeks in silence, and it shaped him in ways that were visible only to those who knew him well. In the way he flinched at sudden noises, in the nightmares that woke him in the dark, in the sadness that lived behind his eyes and never quite left. He died in 1998, at the age of 71, and his obituary made no mention of the feud, the trial, or the men who had died. His grandchildren learned about it only after his death, when they found a box of old newspaper clippings and legal documents in his attic, and even then, they struggled to reconcile the quiet, gentle man they had known with the figure described in the yellow pages. Henrik Vogel, the third survivor, chose a different path. He was released from prison in 1954, and he left Wyoming immediately, moving to California, where he changed his name and disappeared into the anonymity of the post-war boom. He never returned to mining, never spoke publicly about the events of 1949, and never contacted the families of the men who had died. For decades, he lived as a ghost, a man without a past, until 1982, when a graduate student researching labor history tracked him down and convinced him to give a recorded interview. In that interview, conducted in a dingy apartment in Oakland, Henrik spoke for the first time about what happened in Ash Creek, and his account, while consistent with the known facts, added details that had never been made public. He confirmed that Otto Halvorsen's crew had not killed Thomas Ridley, that the shot had come from someone else, someone they never identified, and that the company had used Ridley's death as a pretext to justify a crackdown that had been planned from the beginning. He spoke about the fear, the exhaustion, the sense of being hunted, and the moment in the cabin when he realized they were all going to die. He spoke about the guilt he carried for surviving when so many others had not, and about the dreams that still woke him at night, dreams in which he was back in the forest, running through the snow, hearing gunfire and knowing that there was no escape. The interview was transcribed, deposited in a university archive, and largely forgotten. Henrik Vogel died in 1989, alone, his death unremarked except by the landlord who found his body. The Ash Creek feud of 1949 is not a story that America likes to tell itself. It does not fit neatly into narratives of progress, justice, or the triumph of the common man. It is a story about what happens when ordinary people are pushed beyond the limits of endurance, when the systems that are supposed to protect them fail, and when the only options left are submission or violence. It is a story about 10 men who believed they were fighting for dignity and discovered that dignity, in the eyes of those with power, is expendable. It is a story about a company that valued profit over lives and a legal system that punished the victims while leaving the perpetrators untouched. And it is a story that ended not with justice, but with graves in the snow and men who spent the rest of their lives trying to forget what they had become. There are those who say that the land around Ash Creek is haunted, that on cold winter nights you can still hear the sound of gunfire echoing through the valley, the voices of men calling to each other in the darkness, the grinding hum of a generator that never quite worked the way it should. Locals avoid the area, and the few hunters who venture into the forest speak of a feeling they cannot quite name, a sense of being watched, of walking through a place where something terrible happened and where the earth has not yet forgiven. The ruins of the mine are still there, slowly collapsing, reclaimed by rust and vines. And if you know where to look, you can still find the remnants of the cabin where 7 men made their last stand, charred wood, broken glass, and spent shell casings half buried in the soil. History is written by the victors, they say, but sometimes the victors are not the heroes, and sometimes the losers are not the villains. Sometimes history is written by the survivors, the ones who live long enough to tell the story and to shape it in ways that serve their purposes. And sometimes history is written by no one, and the truth is left to decay in forgotten archives, in unmarked graves, in the silence of men who carried their secrets to the end. The Ash Creek Feud of 1949 is one of those stories, a piece of the past that refuses to stay buried, that resurfaces in fragments, in whispers, in the questions that remain unanswered. What really happened in that valley? Who fired the shot that killed Thomas Ridley? Was Otto Halvorsen a hero or a criminal? Were his men freedom fighters or murderers? The answers depend on who you ask, on what you believe about justice, about power, about the value of a life spent underground in service of someone else's fortune. What we know for certain is this. 10 men went into the wilderness believing they were fighting for something that mattered, and 7 of them never came back. The 3 who survived carried the weight of those deaths for the rest of their lives, and none of them ever found peace. The company that started the conflict continued to operate, continued to extract profit, continued to treat workers as disposable, and face no consequences. The legal system delivered a verdict that satisfied no one and resolved nothing, and the land, the cold, indifferent land, absorbed the blood and the violence and the grief, and continued on, unchanged and unchanging, waiting for the next group of desperate men to arrive and to believe that this time, somehow, it would be different. In the end, the Ash Creek Feud teaches us something uncomfortable about the nature of conflict, about the distance between justice and revenge, and about the ease with which ordinary people can be transformed into something the world will call monstrous. It teaches us that there are no clean endings, no moments of triumph where right defeats wrong and the good are rewarded. There is only survival, and the cost of survival, and a question that haunts every person who has ever stood at the edge of violence and wondered whether to step forward or to turn back. What are we willing to become to protect what we believe is ours? And when we cross that line, when we do the things that we swore we would never do, can we ever return to people we used to be? Or are we forever changed, forever marked by the choices we made in the darkness? The answer, if there is one, lies not in the past but in the present, not in the actions of men long dead, but in the choices we make when faced with the same impossible situations. The names change, the circumstances shift, the technology evolves. But the question remains the same, and it is a question that every generation must answer for itself. How much are we willing to sacrifice? How far are we willing to go? And what does it mean to be human when humanity itself is under siege? The miners of Ash Creek believed they knew the answer, and they paid for that belief with their lives and their freedom. We, looking back from a comfortable distance of decades, can judge them, can argue about whether they were right or wrong, whether they should have fought or surrendered, whether their cause was just or their methods justified. But until we have stood where they stood, felt what they felt, and faced the same brutal calculus of survival versus submission, we cannot truly understand the choices they made, or the darkness that those choices led them into. And so the story ends where it began, in the cold and the silence, in a place where the earth remembers and the wind carries voices that no one wants to hear. Ash Creek is gone now, reclaimed by nature, erased from maps and memory. But the question it poses remains, waiting for the next person to stumble upon it, to pick it up, and to carry it forward into their own uncertain future. What are we willing to become? And when we become it, who pays the price? But there is more to this story. Threads that extend beyond the courtroom and the graves, connections that ripple outward through the decades, touching lives that never knew Ash Creek existed and transforming the feud from a local tragedy into something larger, something that speaks to the nature of memory itself and the way violence echoes through generations. Because the truth is that nothing ever really ends. Not cleanly, not completely. Events have consequences, and consequences have children, and those children grow up in the shadow of things that happened before they were born, carrying burdens they never asked for and making choices shaped by traumas they never experienced firsthand. The memorial stands today, weathered by wind and rain, visited occasionally by hikers who stumble upon it and pause to read the inscription before continuing on their way, most of them unaware of the larger story, of the layers of pain and injustice and unresolved grief that the simple stone represents. And what a question that started all of this, the question that Otto Halvorsen posed his men in the hunting cabin on that February night, the question that has echoed through the decades since. How far are we willing to go? The answer, it seems, is that we are willing to go as far as far as desperation drives us, as far as the circumstances demand. But the real question is not about distance. It is about cost. Because every step forward in a conflict like the one that consumed Ash Creek comes a price, and that price is paid not only by those who fight, but by their families, their communities, their descendants, and by the part of themselves that they sacrifice in order to become the kind of people who can do what needs to be done. Otto Halvorsen and his crew paid that price, and they paid it fully, and whether their sacrifice accomplished anything meaningful is a question that does not have a clear answer. Did they change the system? No. Black Ridge Industrial continued to operate, continued to exploit workers, continued to prioritize profit over safety, and the mine at Ash Creek was just one of hundreds across the country where similar conditions existed and where similar conflicts simmer beneath the surface, occasionally erupting into violence, more often suppressed through intimidation and economic coercion. Did they inspire others to fight back? Perhaps, though the evidence is mixed. There were labor actions in the years following the feud that cited Ash Creek as a rallying point. But there were also workers who looked at what had happened to Otto Halvorsen's crew and decided that the cost of resistance was too high, that survival meant keeping your head down and accepting whatever scraps the company was willing to offer. What they did accomplish, in the end, was this: they refused to be erased. They refused to let the company write the story, to pretend that their lives did not matter, to bury them in paperwork and forgetfulness. They made a choice to fight, and in doing so, they asserted their humanity, their dignity, their right to be treated as something more than replaceable parts in a machine. And even though that choice led to suffering, to death, to decades of grief and trauma, it was still a choice, and in a world where so many people are denied even the illusion of choice, that matters. It does not make them heroes, does not absolve them of the violence they committed or contemplated, does not erase the pain they caused the families of men like Thomas Ridley. But it makes them human, fully and completely human, with all the complexity and contradiction that humanity entails. The Ash Creek feud of 1949 is a story about ordinary people pushed to extraordinary extremes, about the fragility of the systems we trust protect us, and about the terrible clarity that comes when those systems fail, and we are forced to decide who we are going to be in the absence of justice, law, or mercy. It is a story that America has told itself in different forms for as long as there have been workers and owners, miners and mine bosses, people who labor and people who profit from that labor. The names change, the locations shift, the specific circumstances vary, but the fundamental conflict remains the same. What happens when the value of human life comes into conflict with the pursuit of profit? And when that conflict becomes irreconcilable, when dialogue fails and compromise becomes impossible, what are people supposed to do? The land around Ash Creek is quiet now, the kind of quiet that feels deliberate, as if the forest itself is holding its breath, waiting for something that will never come. The mine is sealed, the buildings are gone, and the only evidence that anything ever happened there is a memorial stone and the stories that a few people still tell, passing them down through generations like heirlooms made of sorrow and rage. And perhaps that is enough. Perhaps the point is not to remember every detail, not to reconstruct the past with perfect accuracy, but simply to acknowledge that it happened, that real people lived and died and suffered in ways that were preventable, and that their suffering was not inevitable. It was a choice made by other people, people with power, people who decided that some lives matter less than others. In the end, the ghosts of Ash Creek are not the supernatural manifestations that local legend sometimes suggests. They are the echoes of unanswered questions, the weight of unresolved grief, the knowledge that justice was never served and never will be. They are the 7 men who died in the snow, the 3 men who survived but were never truly free, the families who carried the burden of loss without compensation or closure, and the countless others who have faced the same impossible choices in different places, different times, and who will continue to face them as long as the systems that create such choices remain unchanged. And they are us, the living, the ones who inherit these stories and must decide what to do with them, whether to learn from them, to let them shape our understanding of justice and power and human dignity, or whether to let them fade into obscurity, forgotten and unexamined, until the next tragedy forces us to confront the same questions all over again. Until the next time. Until the next place where desperation meets indifference, where workers are asked to choose between their safety and their survival, where the line between victim and perpetrator blurs until it disappears entirely. Until the next Ash Creek, wherever it may be, whenever it may happen, and whoever may be caught in its machinery. The story does not end. It only pauses, waiting for the next chapter to be written, the next names to be added to the list of those who fought and lost, who stood up and were struck down, who believed that they mattered and discovered, too late, that in the eyes of those with power, they never really did.